Okay, we just finished Module 1.2, which talked about how you can develop an intended use statement or set of statements for your particular distribution model. Now, another important consideration at the start of construction of these types of models deals with the concept of decision risk and how that relates back to the model you're trying to build. And so that's what the topic of Module 1.3 is about. What are you going to learn? Well, you're going to learn about some important modeling caveats. Hopefully, you'll find these somewhat humorous. And these are things that there might be humorous, but you really need to know about them. A little bit about the legal and policy environments that we, at least in applied ecology, I mean, we're all federal, or excuse me, I'm no longer a federal employee. Many of you are federal or state or students who may wish to work in that environment, and you need to understand how that environment operates. Then some definitions of what decision risk is and how that decision risk links back to a concept that's called best practices. Then we'll talk a little bit about a framework for assessing and minimizing decision risk. And again, like much of these many of these introductory modules, there's nothing you will do in R per se. Here are some readings. Again, as I mentioned previously, these readings, there's active links to them, and that you will have received or will receive in your course material a PDF, and all of these links will be active then. You'll be able to find these if you wish to read them prior to showing up. It's just a function of how much time you have before showing up for the course. Now, the theoretical and conceptual bases for distribution models, they are well grounded in defensible published literature. There can be absolutely no argument over that. One of the more curious aspects of distribution models, however, is that direct application to management and conservation of species lags somewhat. Now, why this happens is related to perceptions. And these are not limited to the ones I show below, but they are reasons for a lack of application. First, oftentimes these distribution models are overly complicated and difficult to interpret. Your job is to understand what this model does and work diligently to translate anything that appears complicated into something that's reasonable and understanding so that the decision makers you interact with will understand how the model works. Another common criticism is they are not well grounded in natural history and oftentimes lack common sense. Now, there's two reasons for this. One of them simply has to do with the world of GIS predictors. A lot of the ecological reasons, be it a Grinnellian, an Eltonian, or a Hutchinsonian element as to why a species might be there, there simply is no analog for GIS information that's associated with that. Second, having to do with kind of the common sense that oftentimes the variables that are thrown in themselves, you'll scratch your head or somebody will say, why is this in there? I mean, it's the biggest single predictor. Remind me to bring up the story of the sea beach amaranth by the time we get to predictor levels, and I'll give you an example there. There's also the issue of questionable data quality and quantity, both of which interact and both of which have impacts on how you construct the data. And then there exists among decision makers whether or not these map products in particular depict potential or actual. I have heard state game and fish directors point out that if you present a map I don't care, Tom, how many times you say it's only a potential. The people we discuss management and conservation with are going to view this as actual. I can't help that, but your job is to make sure that decision makers understand that. The last of these, such as my favorite pixel, is one of the more humorous ones, while at the same time quite real. If, for example, you develop a map and you pick a particular area where or the model projects an area where presence is likely or absence is likely, somebody is going to say, well, I have been to that particular pixel and I guarantee you it is or is not there. And that means you have to have an understanding of the error that is associated with these models so that you can respond correctly. Now, here's some caveats that I want you to remember as we go through the course. All models are wrong. Some are useful. Okay, so this is from GPE Box, who is a truly distinguished statistician. Useful is the primary goal of your distribution model. And if you've articulated intended uses and tried to prioritize or work your way through the four uses of the model, where it is, how much there is, why is it there, how is it changing, you can make strong argument that my model is useful. Now, wrong, at least as I interpret it, means there is no single best distribution model ever. Period. Get over it. This is one of the areas where conflict arises because many agencies, particularly Fish and Wildlife Service, by policy and law, are required for the best model. There is no such concept as best models. These are useful. Do they answer the question? Again, we'll go over that by the time we get to Module 7 when we talk about ensemble models. My second favorite caveat is there are three kinds of lies, lies, damn lies, and statistics, depending either attributed to Benjamin Disraeli or Mark Twain. But what it points out is an overemphasis on statistic or today's AI, of which I'm so tired of, I'm beginning to call artificial idiocy now, but an overemphasis on either of these to an exclusion of biology. This is a dangerous circumstance, and so you always want to remember this particular caveat as well. My favorite is, of course, after 7.5 million years of my insertion statistical analysis, the answer to the meaning of life came back from deep thought. There's always a statistical SDM answer, but sometimes it might be 42 and it might not be realistic. This points out the fact that these models will provide you with an answer, but you need to look at it and you need to see, because if the answer comes back as 42, you get the analogy here. But these three things, caveats right here, are just something I ask you keep in the back of your mind whenever you are developing or evaluating any form of distribution model. So why the caveats? We forget these at the risk, remember we're talking about risk right here, and our agency decision environments. The caveats provide operational and philosophical bounds to research that involves the generation and application of any model. They also remind us that these are tools, and tools break and don't always work as well as intended. Think of Mark Twain as well as the answer being 42. They flat out infer that no single model is ever best. Period. Get over it. This was an incredible source of discussion, philosophical, table pounding, beer drinking types of discussion. And I fully understand that many agencies are required to deal with the best. We're going to learn some different ways to come up with best here in the future. And of course, they do poke ironic fun at the overemphasis on statistics to the exclusion of common sense. Remember, I mentioned that's one of the things that many high-level decision makers worry about, as well as sound ecological stories or relationships. Okay, so what are the issues then? And why do the direct applications lag? I want to go back to the initial simple observation. The geographic range of a species in the habitat is integral to virtually all species decision processes. It is. We saw that in Module 1.2 with the range maps that I introduced you to, as well as the management examples. We can generate these distributions, but direct application. So the question is, why the lack of direct applications? Now you need to remember again that these are models, and so they are actual abstractions of perceived reality. We're trying to increase ecological understanding, and we're trying to use these to solve conservation issues. And it helped for us to frame these in these particular philosophical perspectives. Again, review: 1, we survey; 2, we tally; 3, we build; 4, we infer; and 5, we validate. And oftentimes this involves circular feedbacks. So that's our process. And you are going to have to learn how to express this process in terms that decision makers will understand. Because every decision you make in this process, any of these steps right here, constitutes an element of decision risk. So during the process of developing, you want to minimize these risks and generate defensible models that can work on the issues that you are associated with. Now, our biggest decision risk concern, and why we, at least in the US, strive for defensible science, is because of this. Scientific defensibility in the US is a Supreme Court decision, Dauber versus Merrill Dow, whereby the Supreme Court determined that the techniques employed, you're doing a modeling process, must be recognized in the scientific community. What does recognition involve? Publications, focus of research, frequent usage, and be relevant and reliable to the issue. That's the application component we're talking about. So hopefully you can suddenly grasp the process I've discussed here at the beginning, this intended use, the 4 questions you pose to the data, because this helps you achieve to the fullest extent possible a defined scientific defensibility that is embedded in court law in the United States. Now, judges themselves do have considerable latitude in accepting or rejecting the evidence constrained in 1 or 2. And you need to be aware of that. What you want to do, of course, is create something that enhances or increases the likelihood of acceptance of your distribution model. And one of the other curious components that is case law and policy is that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service supported analyses in the cases of like a distribution model, or the range maps developed it through ECOS and Ecological Services, is it presumes primacy over others. Now, this is also under challenge. I must acknowledge that this statement is 2 years old, and frankly, I don't know the status of it. But here's what judges rely on. There is actually a manual on the reference manual of scientific evidence. This is it. It's the judicial Bible. I looked it up one time and it's quite fascinating, particularly the section on fingerprints that if you ever get unfortunately arrested based on fingerprints, I would highly recommend that you read. But there actually is a reference manual for when judges need guidance. And this comes from our own National Academy of Science, right there. Okay, so again, I want to point out that the decision risk we deal with comes from all of the construction steps I've introduced you to thus far. The intended use, the data acquisition, vetting, and organization, the distribution model construction, assessment validation, and its implementation. Now, what happens is decision risk gets minimized, and oftentimes the process for minimizing that gets labeled best practices. Now, the best practices you encounter, this is just a definition from Merriam-Webster, it's a procedure or processes shown by research and experience to produce optimal results. That is, they are proposed as a standard suitable for widespread adoption. Again, doesn't necessarily mean they're the best model. These are the best practices. And the argument in this course is that if you follow these steps, you will increase your likelihood of best practices right here. But it's important to note that best practices themselves are based on subjective decisions. Here's an example. Which statistical model should I use? Now, there are many, many choices. There are strong-willed camps of proponents, acolytes, if I may, who will argue the model they prefer is the best. Now, within distribution modeling, the two most commonly used are random forests and maximum entropy. But does that mean it's best practice and other forms such as logistic regression or boosted trees are not best practices? I don't really have an answer to that, but nonetheless, you just need to be aware of how that happens. Now, I do know that there's about 50,000 cited references of use of random forests. Substantially less in many of these other model forms. So that means they're commonly used. That means they meet the Supreme Court's litmus test of standard and used and accepted by the scientific community. Here's another issue or example of best practices. Is resampling data an appropriate form of model validation? Now, what this means, as we'll see when we get to the module on assessment and validation, is oftentimes we break data into separate chunks, treat one chunk as the test, the other chunk to build the model, and we argue that this constitutes validation. However, from a strict statistic point of view, this is not, repeat, not an independent field test. So you can make strong argument whether an internal validation component like this of the same data constitutes an appropriate form. We'll talk more about this. Now, best practices are often also rolled up into things like standard operating manuals. This is a manual I worked with Ecological Services to develop this a long time ago. That is for their range maps. Oftentimes, policy bulletins exist. If you work in the Department of Interior, then all raw data for decision analyses must be archived. And there even exist handbooks on how to do this. But no matter what, there still is a subjective basis for most best practices, and you need to be aware of that. Now, decision risk also occurs at all of the construction steps in distribution model. Here are some examples of the first step: data acquisition, vetting, and its organization. From what sources will I be obtaining my response data, the presence absence? What predictors should I consider in my model? How do I go about generating pseudo absences given I only have presence data? Now, we will, in fact, discuss each of these three very specific examples right here. But the point of this right here is each one of these constitutes some level of subjectivity. In terms of the construction, which statistical model should I use? How many different models should I build? I mentioned earlier that random forest as a tool is probably the most widely cited tool used, but it has some faults to it. We'll learn about some of the pros and cons of each of these tools as we work our way through the course. In terms of assessment and validation, a truly independent test requires some form of field campaign. Will you have the resources to do that? And last, how should I best portray the output of my distribution model given my articulated objectives? So these are just some of the questions. Now, as I mentioned, we are going to confront each of these types of questions as we work through this module on acquisition, as we build models, as we assess them, and as we implement them at the end. Now, an important caveat: no single analytical process can eliminate decision risk. It can be minimized. And one of the ways to approach minimization is to distill decision risk into two steps. The first is to consider the form of risk, because there are philosophical, technical, and, believe it or not, intractable forms of decision risk. This last one meaning there is nothing you can do to minimize the decision risk, period. The second part you can do here is to properly document, that is, justify, all the analytical steps you have made and the underlying decision. I will argue that this is one of the areas that the builders of distribution models really and truly need to work on. If you don't believe me, ask yourself, have I ever gotten a data set and they forgot to give me a data dictionary? I'm speculating that well over 3/4 of you have confronted this. Ergo, the need for improvement. So here are some examples of a philosophical kind of way to approach decision risk. The reliability of a modeled versus known location. This is as much a philosophical as anything else. This is not a technical issue. You either believe in models and their potential for application to conservation, or you don't. So this is an opinion. If you don't believe in models, you cannot logically employ PVA, occupancy, mark recapture, et cetera, and reject distribution models. You simply don't like models in ecology. It is a philosophical stance, and I cannot help you. Serious. Sometimes you may be confronted with this. I mentioned earlier, I have encountered directors of game and fish arguments. This is what I threw back. It was not pleasant. A second of these is technical. Now, one of the things we'll learn about is something called a classification threshold, which translates the continuous probability of the statistical tool into a binary presence or absence. This is a technical issue, and solution sets do exist. There are numerous options that you can employ here based on the objectives. Now, you may end up having intense discussion over the choice, but a technical, defensible solution exists. In short, resolution can be reached and it can be backed with appropriate science-based literature. Some of these things are mixtures. The philosophical choice of a statistical algorithm can be technically resolved. I've combined these. The technical concern over historical data can be resolved philosophically, flipping it around the other way. So sometimes mixtures of philosophical and technical scopes can be resolved as well. Now, no single end user wins. You cannot simultaneously solve 100% of the philosophical while simultaneously solving 100% of the technical. It doesn't work that way. But this at least provides a framework by which you and the people you work with can come up with some sort of solution that makes everybody happy. Last is the intractable component, and this is the most common. Data densities are insufficient for any reasonable distribution modeling effort. In this case, you need to be brutally honest and don't push a non-defensible modeling environment when you have no data. This is a very uncomfortable situation to many, but I've seen way too many instances where people take data densities that are intractable or uncertainty associated with those data back to the data quality and quantity issue. And this is untractable. There is no solution set. You can't approach this from either a philosophical or technical reason. This may be a case where you have to back off from the formal statistical models we talked about into more of expert opinion or even collapsing back into a heuristic. And again, I understand it's uncomfortable, but this is something you may be confronted with as you begin building distribution models. So categorizing these concerns for decision risk into these three groups provides kind of a structured approach. It allows you to begin examining the characteristic of concerns. Again, remember those questions I posed when it comes time to acquire your data, vet it, organize it, which tool to select, how to assess, how to implement, and hopefully search for a resolution. Minimal worst case is you can at least document that we considered these particular issues and we have opted to do this. You are way better off writing things like that out rather than ignoring it. And so then that becomes a basis for assigning decision risk. So how do we possibly go about expressing this? List the concerns, develop posed queries, and a priori provide answers to your decision risk environments. Assess the process you've done and determine if the concerns were addressed and use these concerns as part of the analytical pathway. Now, this sounds complex, but one of the things we've talked about this is that there does exist literature and a host of other guidance on best practices. This perhaps is one of the best articulated papers on how one can examine the risk associated with steps in the construction of the distribution model that is currently available. There's two excellent papers, one by Helen Sofer here and Miguel Arujo right here. Both of these papers are superb, and I highly recommend you read them. Now, the SOFR approach was to do this. So you can kind of see we have the species data. We're in step 2 here, the data. The quality, are their backgrounds? Have the data been evaluated? Then they used a very simple red light, yellow light, green light, and references are associated over here. So this is a very structured approach by which you can minimize decision risk that is associated with the distribution modeling you're trying to build. This process does not eliminate the role of subjectivity, it merely reduces it, and hence the use of the classic red, yellow, and green stoplight components right there. Get really nervous here, okay, possibly move forward, go ahead. Another example, notice that right inside here, note there is an intended use. Incorporate into regional conservation. Guide the APHIS surveillance program. APHIS surveillance. Herbicide application. Now, you know, remember some of the examples I talked about? Setting up field sampling right here. The invasive plant species right here. Regional conservation for diverse stakeholders, the rare plants and energy development. So you can kind of see this approach can help you develop a defensible model, which is the goal of this course. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and end Module 1.3, which gave you an overview of the decision risk elements you face when constructing a distribution model. There's no exercise right here. And after this, we're going to move on and you get to watch a video associated with Module 1.4, which I provide an overview of some of the statistical underpinnings of distribution models.